Hello and welcome to the Iraqi Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Juma Iraqi. And today I have with me Dr. Shawn Arent. Shawn, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Juma. How are you doing?
I'm doing perfect. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast.
My
So,
pleasure.
so the topic for today is physique versus sports nutrition. And I remember in April I was at the ISSN London conference and heard you speak on this topic. So I was really impressed with first off your how you present first off, but also
Thank you.
the things that you were talking about, because I think it's a really important topic to discuss in today's industry. So before we start, I just want to mention that this podcast will be available on YouTube in video format, but you can also listen to it on iTunes and also SoundCloud as well. So Shawn, before we start with the questions, could you just give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey in the United States. We're one of the top 64 research universities in the nation. So I work real closely with, I'm in exercise science, but I'm also the director of the Center for Health and Human Performance, which is a new facility that we just opened last October. So it's about 6,000 square feet. We do testing and training in there. We do a lot with the teams at Rutgers, and for the European audience that isn't as familiar with the university here structure for athletics, considered almost like semi-professional level, or the development programs that you get over in Europe with some of the premier leagues and stuff like that. So it's pretty high level. We're in one of the major conferences here. So we have some pretty good athletes that come through here. I'm also on the medical and scientific advisory board for Quest Diagnostics, which does a lot with biomarkers, health markers, things like that. So my background is exercise endocrinology. So I deal a lot with hormones, especially stress hormones, anabolic hormones. And, I'm also the graduate director here. So I've got a great group of graduates to work with that a lot of the stuff taught today, they've been a big help with as well.
Perfect. Do you have any background in sports yourself?
Yeah, so I played competitively up through college in soccer, or your version of football.
Yeah.
So European real football, right? So I played, I also wrestled, played football, American football, up through Intel College as well. On top of that, once I was done with that, I competed in bodybuilding for a number of years. I was teenage Mr. Virginia, competed primarily at the NPC level at least the regional and national level. So I'm familiar with both the physique and the sports side of what we do. I'd say a majority of what I do now is working with athletes, though clearly we still have a huge interest in hypertrophy and physique nutrition too. We do a lot of obesity work in my lab. So we're interested, more in the weight loss side, not necessarily with the high level bodybuilding side. And then my wife was actually an IFBB pro in figure until pretty recently. She just retired a few years ago. So anyway, I've seen it at all levels at this point.
Impressive. I understand that she switched over to doing more of a marathon and endurance training.
Yeah, which seems pretty incredible to go from a figure or physique type sport to somebody. She actually just did her 29th marathon. So she's a sponsored athlete with General Nutrition Centers with GNC, and still continues with them, doing a lot of their trade shows and health and fitness expos for them, as well as running for them. And they sponsored her when she was in the IFBB as well.
29, that's impressive.
I know. I don't know how she does it.
Yeah. So, but I also understand that you work. Do you still work with the New Jersey Devils?
So I don't anymore. I worked with them for a season and a half. We did their preseason testing this last season as well. But honestly, it was a great opportunity. What they were looking for didn't really fit what our interests were when all was said and done. But I think in the first season we were able to implement some pretty cool testing with them. I'm starting to do a little bit more at the NFL level this summer through Quest Diagnostics. So even that's been good. And I've actually been on the U.S. Soccer national staff since 1999.
Okay, interesting. I actually enjoy I work with a lot of hockey players, and they're definitely my favorite athletes to work with. Compared to, I also work with a lot of soccer players, and
Yeah.
comparing soccer to hockey, I just feel that soccer players usually are a bit lazy. Both on
Yeah,
the
I would agree with that. The exception is on the women's side. So like our women's soccer players here at Rutgers, and I think you see this with our national team as well, is their work ethic and their commitment has been phenomenal. But we also have a top 4 team in the country here. We finished in the Final Four this year for the College Cup, which speaks volumes to the coaches and the players themselves. But I would agree. I think hockey has probably been one of my favorite sports to work with. Their work ethic is just different. They're the only group that I remember consistently working with where you run, consecutive Wingate tests on them, or you do VO2 max testing, to the point where they're exhausted and they get off and they thank you. They're like, thank you, because they know it's helping their performance. But just a great group of guys to work with. I think that's probably been one of the most enjoyable things I've done in my career to this point. I've done some really great stuff. Like I've been very lucky to have some of the opportunities that I have. It's been good. But the NHL side was pretty unique and definitely a great group of guys.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with the work ethic with the hockey player. There's definitely something that sticks out with those type of athletes compared to
sure.
Yeah. Okay, Shawn. So, like I said, today's topic is physique versus sports nutrition, and to just get the questions started, like if you look fit, like if you look muscular and shredded, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will perform well. They're usually two separate things. So you working with athletes, do you feel sometimes that the athletes pay too much attention to the way they look, and can that potentially be detrimental for their performance?
Absolutely. And it's probably more common than people realize, especially at the college level. We see this a lot working with the female athletes. They want to look good. The part they forget is that if you train like an athlete, you'll look like an athlete too. So they get too caught up in some of the body image stuff, and then it impacts performance. They don't eat enough. They're worried about weight gain, whatever it is. And I think that can be a real challenge to work on. The other thing too is when you look at where they get some of their information through popular media, through social media and things like that, so much of the information that's out there is about how to look better, and it really doesn't deal with function. It's really an issue of form over function in that case. And I think that in many cases they get information that's really not appropriate for them from a performance standpoint. And that can lead to a whole nother set of problems when you're working with a team where your primary concerns are recovery and getting ready for the next practice and the next game and improving physical capacity. And all of those things start to really matter. Don't get me wrong. I think that I have no problem with an athlete taking pride in their body and how they look. I think they should. But the function should come before the form. And I think when they get too caught up in the physique recommendations, and that can even have to do with the type of training they do, where they just want to add muscle mass, and that might not be what's best for their sport, especially if they're in a weight category sport. So it really comes down to specific performance recommendations versus the how I look recommendations. And I don't have a problem on either side, depending on what somebody's goals are. But if I'm working with an athlete, they need to be an athlete first and foremost. It has to be about performance. And what they generally find is the form comes with that too. They look pretty damn good when all is said and done, considering the type of training and nutrition that they need to follow for optimum performance.
Yeah, I totally agree. And a great example, the thing that you mentioned, that they get the information from the popular media. We have like the last year here in Norway, the government has had a really huge focus on reducing sodium intake among the population because of hypertension and stuff like that. So I've had a lot of athletes come into me and they haven't really changed anything with their training or with their diet, but suddenly they start to cramp up, they start to perform worse and stuff. And when I ask them what have you changed lately, is I quit ingesting, like I cut out all my sodium. And why did you do that? And it's because that's what they recommend. So teaching them what's appropriate for you as an athlete compared to the normal population or other recommendation is also really important.
Well, and I think that probably on my end, the single biggest problem I've seen are the carbohydrate recommendations. So now from a carbohydrate standpoint, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I heard carbs are bad for you and carbs make you fat and this and that. And you need them for fuel for these sports we're talking about, whether it's soccer or football or basketball or hockey. And so there's an educational process that goes on that's kind of beyond just simply what to eat. It's also why. We try to teach the athletes about the bioenergetics in simpler terms, so that they get why carbs are not their enemy. And I think that, to me, that is probably one of the biggest disservices that the physique side of nutrition has played for the athlete, is this carb phobia. It goes right along with gluten phobia, where now all of a sudden every athlete thinks they're also gluten intolerant and gluten's bad for me and this and that, and they start avoiding all kinds of things. And there's just a lot of misinformation, and sometimes it's not even misinformation; it's the wrong information for what they need. And look, they're not all equipped to learn how to filter it. They don't know what applies to them and what doesn't, so they just look at what's getting the most attention, and if they're worried about how they look and things like that, some of the message gets lost in terms of what's really important for them. And I think that's where we run into problems.
Yeah. I also think usually when you work with teams or in a group, it's usually one guy that starts to test something, and then the ball starts rolling, and suddenly all the other guys also want to test it out as well.
Well, the other thing I see too is it also applies to supplements. So in other words, they'll be flipping through like the muscle mags, or they'll be on, whatever bodybuilding site, and they'll hear about this new pre-workout or this or that or the other. And I'll have athletes come to me, hey, what about this? And I'm like, it's banned in your sport. You can't take that. They're not always able to filter that. And they also don't understand the difference between what works and what is mostly hype and marketing. So even teaching the athletes the difference between supplements that really have research support for performance or health versus something that's just going to jack you up in terms of intensity and make you feel like you're ready to run through a brick wall. There's a difference, and it's helping them understand what works, what doesn't, what's quality, what's allowed. It's a big part of the educational process. And unfortunately, I think because of the way that's happened at times, I think a lot of sort of sports medicine staffs will take the approach of supplements are bad.
Yeah.
Right? No, because you don't want to test positive and this has no research. So they just go blanket statement, don't take supplements. Man, there's a time and a place for supplements. They shouldn't be your whole diet, but they're a great way to get certain nutrients or certain metabolites that can really help you perform. But I think the educational process needs to be better there, and it can't just be based on what you see on a social media post for somebody that might be advertising something. And I think that's where good information is really very, very useful.
Yeah, I totally agree, and especially on the supplements, where basically you sometimes have two camps: one that promote use of a lot of supplements, especially the supplement industry, and then you have on the other end people that just say don't use anything at all. So I totally agree with you that some supplements that have a lot of data on them should be considered if they can give an advantage to the athletes.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, and as long as, and teaching them what to look for that's not tainted potentially. What does NSF testing mean? What is, certified, banned substances certified? All these things, I think it's an important message to get out to them as prolific as the supplement industry has become. I mean, I'll be the last one to say don't use supplements, but it'd be the first one to tell you don't use certain supplements because they don't work. And I kind of boil it down with a lot of athletes that I work with, where there's maybe 5 or 6 that I'll consistently recommend. Outside of that, it's not that impressive. That doesn't mean that more won't come down the pipeline that have promise. I'm just saying, based on what we know now and what you can feel good about investing your time or money into, there's not a lot. And to me, that's a good thing, because I never want the athletes to think that that's their ticket to performance. I think quality of training, quality of diet, quality of sleep, all of those things have to come first. The supplements are the part that take you that little extra bit to give you an advantage, because let's face it, when it comes to training for sports, it's not about fairness. You want to be better than everybody else.
Yeah.
So any little advantage you can get, and that includes training techniques and nutritional techniques, I think you do it. You take advantage of it when you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was Dr. Graham Close. He was talking about at the ISEN conference last year in Newcastle. He was talking about that there was a pretty low number of athletes that knew what the logo Informed Sport was on the labels.
Yeah.
And he also showed where do athletes get their information on supplements from. So nutritionists and like the staff weren't high on the list. It was more teammates or the general media. So it's still a lot of work to do, obviously.
And Graham's a perfect example. God, he does great work. But the thing I also love about him and a lot of the guys over in the UK is the fact that not only do they do the research, and this is the model I try to follow here as well, is not only do we do the research, but we also work with high-level athletes.
Yeah.
So being able to take the research into practice, I think becomes critical because it forces you to ask the so what question. How and why does this work and what does it really mean? And I think that, Graham and some of that group have really been at the forefront of being able to do that. And I think that their ability to educate athletes along the way is critical, and so kudos to that whole group because, I like the model they follow because it's the same thing I try to do as well.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. So when we're on the topic of body composition, you often see that like athletes get really obsessed with body composition measurements, and you have to like reach a certain number of body fat percentage to be qualified as being fit. So do these exact numbers really matter for an athlete for performance, and what type of limitation do actually the body composition measurements tools that we use have?
Yeah, so to kind of put it all in context, body composition matters. Yes, it does. But does the difference between, say, in a female athlete, the difference between 18 and 19% body fat make a big difference? No. And I think that a lot of it comes down to the way we use body composition is really in two ways, primarily with the sports I work with. The first one is to make sure we're not losing muscle mass in season. So in other words, it's very important for us to track body comp so that we have some other barometer of recovery as well, and to make sure that what we're doing to maintain muscle is actually working and that we're not breaking down. The second is also to identify athletes who may have too much body fat or too little from a function standpoint, both from a health and safety standpoint. Where I get concerned about body composition at the high end is if you have an athlete that's, let's say, in a power endurance sport. So it could be field hockey, soccer, volleyball, some of those, right? The problem you have is if they're carrying too much body fat and they land and cut, that's a lot of extra weight that's not carrying its own weight. So in other words, it's not only does it impact performance, but it impacts injury risk as well. That's my concern with too much body fat. On the too little side, there's going to be a lot of variability. We've had female athletes that will become amenorrheic around 14 or 15% body fat. We've had others that even at 10 or 11% body fat function just fine. So there's a lot of individual variability, which is why we use other markers as well. I think the caution that I would give a lot of people is don't focus so much on the specific number. They have to understand that every technique of body comp assessment has standard error. So it's plus or minus a certain percentage. So you might be 18% one time and 19% another. That may very well be within the normal testing parameters of whatever you're using. So does it mean you gained a percent body fat? Not necessarily. But I think the other thing that's important is to make sure you're consistent whatever method you use. So if you use bod pod, use that consistently. If you use skin fold calipers, use that consistently and make sure the same person tests you each time, because there's even differences in the people that do the assessment. I think it depends on what you have access to. It'd be great for me to sit here and tell everybody to go get a DEXA done, but there's inherent flaws in DEXA as well. And not only that, but it's expensive and it's great for bone density from the standpoint of muscular versus fat components. From a segment standpoint, in terms of where you're carrying it, it's awesome. Otherwise, do I prefer it over other techniques? Not when I'm working with large teams necessarily, or just teams in general, because I think that some of it comes down to ease of use. If you have a quicker protocol that you can get an entire team through, the coaches are more likely to give you that time to be able to do it. And so I think all of those things matter. But no, don't get caught up too much in the specific number. What we normally do with our athletes is we give them a range that they're in. So kind of like an optimal, a very good, and then you may get to a point where it's like, ooh, too high, too low. And we try to work with them on that from a health and performance standpoint. But like I said, we typically use it to try to track changes. And I think that's the important part, is using it as a barometer of change rather than an absolute number is much more useful, because it gives you an idea of what's happening sort of internally in terms of recovery. And if you've got an athlete who needs to gain muscle mass, it's a great way to make sure it's happening outside of just the strength. So there's a lot of good ways to use it. Trying to make the number the be-all, end-all, where you need to be 17% to perform well, or if you're a guy, you need to be 8% to perform well. I think people miss what that really means. And I also laugh when I hear a lot of bodybuilders say what their percent body fat is. And they're like, oh yeah, I was like 2% body fat. I was 3% body fat. Honestly, I'm like, no, you weren't. I'm like, do you understand how low that is and how dysfunctional that is? And I think a lot of it comes from the technique. The problem you have with a lot of measurement techniques is once you get below 5 or 6% body fat, it's almost a guess at how low it goes from there, because most of them don't have that lower range, and you're not accounting for other, visceral fat and things like that. So, like I said, I don't get too caught up in the numbers except to use as a monitoring tool along with every other part of our fitness assessments that we actually do.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And especially with, like, people say that DEXA is the gold standard, and
Right.
and if DEXA gives you the number, it has to be correct. But like you said, DEXA also has its limitations. I think it's also dependent on that you use the same DEXA machine, because they're programmed specifically by the manufacturers.
Well, especially brand, because I think there was a study that was done recently, for example, with BodPod. There was a study that came out pretty recently showing that there was pretty good reproducibility from one BodPod to the next to the next. And that's a good sign. But certainly with DEXA, the problem you have is they use proprietary algorithms to calculate lean mass, bone mass, fat mass. And if you're using different manufacturers, that algorithm is going to differ, and we don't know what it is. So now it may be just different enough that it's giving you a slightly variable reading. The other thing too is if you ever want to feel really good about yourself and you want to feel like you lost a ton of body fat before you do a DEXA, just carb load right before you do it. It makes it look like you gained a whole bunch of lean muscle mass. There's stories about that happening in research where these people get these amazing lean muscle numbers and changes with their training program, and it was because they carb loaded their subjects before they did the next assessment. So, that's, like I said, it's all part of a tool. The only way you'll really know how much body fat you're carrying, truly a precise number, is autopsy.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I'm not in a rush for that. So
Yeah, me too.
in that case, I'm okay with estimations. I just want to make sure it's a good estimation so that I make sure I'm giving good information to the athletes or using good information for myself so that we can guide the overall approach for training and diet in that case. That's mostly the way we use it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, I say the same thing to the athletes that I work with, that don't get too caught up with what type of tools that you're using to assess. Because I personally like the Skinfold caliber,
Sure.
because it's easy to use, it's affordable, it's portable, you can take it everywhere, and it's like if you have somebody that's Isaac accredited, for
Yeah.
example, that has a lot of training with doing the Skinfold, you actually can get really consistent numbers with it. Because I think the last year or so, I've had so many athletes that tell me, oh, they want to do a DEXA scan instead of the Skinfold calibers. Now I tell them exactly what you said, that there's still limitations doing the DEXA scan, because let's face it, it wasn't really designed for body composition. It was designed for bone
Oh,
density, like you said, and But should somebody be concerned with the small amount of radiation that you can get from DEXA if you do it frequently?
If you do it frequently, well, let me put it this way. I don't know about being concerned, but I don't know that I would accept it as not a big deal at all either. So, I could throw somebody in a bod pod once a week. Now, is that going to give me the right answers? Probably not, 'cause it's too frequent, but I could. You could do skin folds every week if you wanted to, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that I would put somebody on a DEXA once a week. In terms of the radiation exposure, it is still a reality. I wouldn't say it's to the point where if somebody's getting a scan 2-3 times a year that it's enough for them to freak out about. I don't want to freak anybody out about DEXA. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm bad-mouthing DEXA and basically saying, oh, it's garbage. No. It's a good measurement tool. I'm just saying it may not be necessary, and it's not necessarily giving you that much better information than anything else. And let's face it, and when it comes to skin folds, it's a lot cheaper to do skin folds when it comes to the cost of calipers and the anthropometric measures that go along with it than it is to buy a bod pod or a DEXA or some of those. So, ultimately, a lot of it comes down to cost as well. I'm lucky. I have a great research lab. We have our own bod pod. Technically, we have 2, and so I can use that. Would I be okay using skin folds if I didn't have that? Yeah, I would. But you have to be really well trained on it. And I think that, even in the wrong hands, even a DEXA is not exactly foolproof when it comes to who reads the results as well and how it's done. So a lot of it comes down to how you prepare the athlete in terms of making sure they're consistent in the time of day and their food intake, their exercise before it and all that stuff. As long as you're real consistent with that, I agree with you. You could easily use skin folds. You're probably giving them every bit of the same information they're really looking for anyway. What you can't do with a bod pod or a DEXA or hydrostatic weighing is you can't assess bone density. So if you have an athlete, like let's say it's an endurance athlete that we know is underweight and may be at risk for osteopenia or osteoporosis, then yes, I think in that case, a DEXA is very warranted. But for just body composition, I get why people want it. Sounds awesome, and it gets talked about a lot, but it doesn't mean it's the only method or that even in all cases it's the best method. Don't get me wrong, from a scientific standpoint, I love it, but I also know there's ways to influence it as well.
Yeah, exactly. So it's important that people know of the limitation that it also has. So, yeah. So when it comes to sports nutrition recommendations, it's often divided into the specific sport. But if you look at the recommendations in the bodybuilding industry, for example, they have taken a lot of those recommendations and like misrepresented it and put it in another different context. So, for example, when it comes to the amounts of carbohydrates that you need when you do resistance training, is this something you also experience yourself? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think I haven't. The funny part is I haven't seen it as much at the higher levels of the physique competitions and physique competitors. I think they have it figured out a little bit better that maybe there are some differences. But where I tend to see it is actually people that are trying to lose weight and think they go run on the treadmill for 45 minutes and then go, pound 90 grams of carbohydrate plus whatever amount of protein, and they have to eat I think that gets lost a little bit. I don't think they have a real concept of how many calories they actually just burned or are continuing to burn afterwards in terms of EPOC. And so I think that sometimes that gets lost. And I think there's some great research that's come out recently showing that the carbohydrate quantity doesn't have to be as high as we thought it did. So 30 grams per standpoint works as well as 60 grams in some cases. And I think where it was lost is there are certain sports, like for example with soccer, there's a great, what I consider historical study by Bengt Saltine, where they looked at glycogen depletion in soccer players, and they saw about a 95% glycogen depletion from the beginning of the game to the end of the game. And it was about 50% by halftime, if not slightly more. The problem is, I think people believe they deplete glycogen more than they do with resistance training. In a lot of cases, with a really intense program, it might be 50 or 60% depletion. Heck, even with Wingate testing, The funny thing is this gets misrepresented. Oh, you're doing HIIT, you're doing these all-out cycling bursts and you're depleting glycogen. There's some work that's been shown that's been done that shows that you get about a 50% glycogen depletion on that first wind gate, but it tapers after that. So in other words, 2 doesn't equal 100%. It's like 2 is like 60% and then 68%. So there's this kind of curve that goes down. And so I think that I think the misrepresentation comes when people think that they've really done more work than they have. And I think it depends on what you're training for. Where I do think the recommendations have translated fairly well is on the protein intake stuff. So and honestly, if I'm looking at a lot of our athletes, the ones that may need more protein than others might even be on the endurance side of things because they use it for fuel quite a bit too. So, I think that part has translated well. I think the carbohydrate part has not. And I think the other part that doesn't translate as well too is trying to figure out whether you're trying to lose body fat, whether you're trying to get as lean as possible, whether you're trying to gain muscle, or whether you're trying to perform for a sport. And I think being able to separate out the differences in terms of everything from caloric deficit on the weight loss side to a protein accumulation on the hypertrophy side to glycogen replenishment on the performance side, I think you need to distinguish what the goals of that session, that workload, and really your program are trying to be so that you know how to match those needs. And even for an athlete, we could make a strong argument for periodizing nutrition depending on which of those areas they're trying to target throughout their off-season or preseason to get the most out of their training. So, I think there could be periods of high carb intake versus low carb intake. I'm not a keto fan when it comes to ketogenic diets for almost any athlete. And I think if nothing else, for those that would argue that keto works for endurance sports, I still have yet to see the study that shows that it works better. And I think when they tell me, oh, but the keto the fat adaptation period wasn't long enough, give your athletes at least 6 weeks. I don't know about you, but having worked within hockey in the NHL, their off season is about 2 to 3 months, about 2 months if they make it to the Stanley Cup. The problem is I don't have 6 weeks for an athlete to fat adapt because they're going to miss a whole bunch of quality training in that period of time. So I think it depends on what you're gearing up for and how you're trying to use it. And I think that has really gotten lost on the performance side. Maybe there's some benefits on the physique side. Still haven't seen those be any better than anything else. But, these are things that get promoted. And I think this is where there's a little bit of lost information transitioning from sport performance to physique development. And I think the thing I try to remind both athletes and physique competitors of is that for an athlete, the single most important time to be able to perform is on the day of competition, right? I mean, if you're at your lowest point on the day of a game, you're kind of screwed. On the other hand, if you take a physique competitor, the time where they're probably at their worst performance is on the day of competition because they have nothing left in the tank. It's all about how they look. They've depleted. They're at their weakest. So it's a very different approach in terms of the continuum for what you're trying to do in that period of time. And I think that's the part they have to keep in mind as they're trying to figure out how to strategize their diet and their training for what their goals are. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, I totally agree. And back to the Saltin study that you mentioned, I think they actually, when they look at how much the athlete were walking during the game, the high carb group was walking 25%, but the low carb group was walking 50% of the game.
Well, and and it's funny, even in soccer, and this part, you're talking 90 minutes. If it goes to added time, you've got whatever time spent at a high intensity. But we have athletes, and we're lucky. I mean, some of the data that we have on our teams here is unbelievable from a training load standpoint. But yeah, there is a good portion of the game that is spent walking, not as much spent sprinting as everybody thinks, yet that might be the discerning time. Yeah. So in other words, getting to that 50-50 ball, and if you have a little more left in your tank, especially in added time, that a 50-50 ball turns into a 60-40, you're getting on the ball and you're getting a goal. And I think it's those little advantages that make a big difference. I'd say for a majority of the people that consider themselves interested in physique that aren't competitors per se, but just want to look better, I think sometimes you can get too caught up in the small details when you're not taking care of the bigger picture, when I'm working with a competitive athlete, especially at the level we work with them and above, little details make a big difference. Now you're talking about gold medals that are won and lost by 0.02%. And so those little differences can be a big deal. And that's where the details do matter. I think on the other side, you really got to look at big picture and figure out what the most important things are. Then you can start working on the details. And same thing with athletes. If you don't have the bigger issues ironed out, it's not going to matter whatever the details are, but the details probably matter a little more when all is said and done too.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like you said, I still haven't seen a study that shows better performance when you do a ketogenic diet. Louis Burke has a great review on this.
Yes,
that
does
tracks
awesome work.
Yeah, awesome work on looking at ketogenic diets for performance. And actually, the only studies that I've seen that shows that there's no difference, it's usually low to medium intensity activities and not high intensity. Even in marathon that people think are medium intensity, when they actually look at the sprint at the end, they actually see detrimental effect when you don't ingest enough carbohydrates.
Absolutely. And I think there was some really good data at the ACSM conference last year, so 2015, where they've actually shown that, can you run a marathon on a keto diet? Yes, absolutely you can. But what's the fastest you could expect to go? You're probably not going to break 3 hours if that's your main fuel. Yeah. And that's not going to win you any marathons. Yeah. That reality is at the elite level. Now, for ultra endurance, heck, even with ultra endurance, and I guess the part that I laugh at a little bit is that with ultra endurance, you'll see people that say, oh, well, this athlete won this ultra endurance event being a keto athlete. And my thought is, yeah, but I bet we could probably name 100 others that have won that weren't. Yeah. So that's great that you have that example, but that's maybe a little bit unique, but at the same time, I still haven't seen enough evidence to suggest it's better. And so I guess my question always comes back to, but why would you?
Yeah.
And I guess, and you heard me talk about this at ISSN in London, is there is a big difference between can we and should we?
Yeah.
And just because you can run a race if you are keto adapted and you follow a ketogenic diet, should you? Yeah. I still haven't seen that evidence. Yeah. And if there's a need for a higher intensity, I think the work that's shown that fat adaptation causes a reduction in pyruvate dehydrogenase activity. Now, all of a sudden, when you need it, you can't even use carbs as effectively.
Yeah.
That's a problem. Yeah. And I'm, when I look at athletes, let's take the ultra endurance stuff out of it. Let's look at everything from triathletes to soccer players to hockey players, whatever it is. I can't think of a scenario for them where a ketogenic diet would be a better idea. Not in those power endurance type of sports. It just doesn't make sense to me. Now, medically, I think there are some amazing applications for ketogenic diets. There's even some good information on fat loss and weight loss with them. But I think what you see with those in particular with the fat loss and weight loss is that the best diet is the one you stick to.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be keto. It can be all kinds of things. Hell, there's even evidence that the paleo diet works. Not because the theory behind it's right. It's because people cut out the crap in their diet when they follow it. So you're getting rid of a lot of the stuff that you shouldn't be eating. And so I think that ultimately what you can adhere to becomes useful. And I think the other thing that I want people to understand is with some of these studies that are coming out now where they promote these keto diets, they're not actually a ketogenic diet. They are a low carb, high protein, high fat diet. A ketogenic diet is not high protein, not by definition. And I think people have to distinguish the difference. There's a difference between a low carb and a ketogenic diet. And I think that that's important because there may be times where you train in a low carbohydrate availability state. I think James Morton and his group have some good information on this. I don't find it overwhelmingly compelling. I think it depends on the sport and depends on how you apply it, but I think there is some utility there. Yeah. But in terms of the keto side, I don't think that's been supported to the degree that everybody thinks.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think a lot of work that Dr. James Morton does on carbohydrate. The one thing that I've noticed is that like sports nutrition used to be like more of a shotgun approach with carbohydrates, that the more the better. And now it's more like gears towards that you customize it based on the demands that you have and that you periodize it during the week. And I think that's a more sensible approach to do. and it's good to see that it's moving forward on that end, that it's not
Absolutely.
even with the different types of sport. You see, like cross country skiers, they might need the highest amounts, but
Right.
looking at, take powerlifters for example, you
Yeah.
don't need like 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight to
No.
perform in powerlifting.
No, and I think, what I find useful, another group that often doesn't even get mentioned is when you're talking about this kind of personalizing the diet or making it relevant to the bioenergetics of that sport. Some do need a lot more carb than others. There's no question. The other thing too is when you're working with some of those sports that need a high carbohydrate diet and then all of a sudden one of the athletes gets injured, one of the other things to teach them is they can't keep eating like they did when they were playing, because then they just gain a lot of weight. So even learning to titrate the calorie requirements, they need enough calories to heal, but they're not expending the same number of calories they were when they're playing a 90-minute match twice a week, in addition to practice. So even that group, you need to fine tune the details. And I'm a big fan of that. I don't like making over generalizations. I think we can make some generalizations about what doesn't work, but I think in terms of what does work, I think actual percentages, actual dosing will vary from sport to sport, but I think we can come up with some fairly robust recommendations that at least put you in the ballpark, and then you can move it up or down from there without having to get overly inundated with the details where the athlete gets lost in the process.
Yeah.
And I do think from a scientific standpoint, I like to know the particulars. I want to know mechanisms, all this. When you're working with an athlete, they want to know the so what and how much. In other words, like, tell me what to do. Because if you start getting, well, you need this amount of carbohydrate now, but then you can do a little bit less here, and then you do a little bit more here. With some of the athletes we work with, we would lose them. They would get so confused. And so I think it's an ongoing educational process. And I also think there's a unique ability in the people that are really good at working on the applied side to be able to boil down the information into the critical messages. And then once the athlete understands the basics, now you can layer on the additional information to fine tune it. But I think you have to start somewhere without inundating them and overwhelming them with way too much right off the get-go.
Yeah, I totally agree. People often forget the communication side, and that if you give too much details, you just lose the attention of the athlete. So it's important that you take the research and boil it down to just basically what they need to know and how they can apply it in their nutrition and in their training.
Oh, 100%. And I think that you also have to understand who you're working with. I think one of the things that's happened in the physique versus sport world is that, and I'm not going to say that this is because of the individuals doing it. To me, it's been more on the research side where this has started to happen, is the physique approach has almost taken this, what's the least we can do?
Yeah.
Do you really need to do this? And the sport world, especially the athletes that I work with, and the research we drive is, how much can I get away with? How far can I push before I overreach? How far can I overreach before I overtrain? It's, what do I need to do more and make myself better? And I think that some of this is coming from the research side, and it's, even the nutrient timing stuff. I think people need to understand there's a difference between nutrient timing and just protein timing. The protein timing part for a majority of people, maybe it's not overly important, but again, my question would be, well, why wouldn't you time it? And I think that, and I know the Schoenfeld meta, they basically said that timing wasn't that important. The bigger issue is total protein intake. I don't disagree with that. I think the bigger issue is total protein intake, and they do a fair job of pointing that out and have done a better job even recently of emphasizing that and saying, but if you get that part taken care of, then the timing does become relevant. And I think Stu Phillips' work does a good job of showing that more frequent feedings, every 2-3 hours, do stimulate muscle protein synthesis a little bit more. I also think people get a little too caught up in the muscle protein synthesis. There's more to protein use than just MPS. And for an athlete, some of that's repair and recovery that goes along with it too. So, I think it's deciphering the message, knowing what research was done in trained individuals versus novice, I think is really important, and understanding what timing really means. And I think when you start to look at the work where it says, the maximal protein bolus that you can really utilize to get the most out of is maybe up to 0.3 grams per kilogram per dose. So if we do some easy math, here's the problem I have with that. So if you look at, even Stu's work, where they showed that 2.4 grams per kilogram per day would allow you, even in a caloric deficit, if you train hard enough, you can gain muscle and lose fat. So we'll make this pretty simple. I'm roughly 100 kilos, about 97 kilos. So by that math, if all I can take in is 30 grams at a time, but I need 240 grams per day by that recommendation, I'm going to have to eat 8 times a day, right? First of all, that becomes a full-time job. Second of all, I got to believe that I can use more than 30 grams at a time if that's the case. And the other part is, no matter how you cut and slice that, clearly timing is going to matter to me, because as soon as my workout's done, I'm going to want to eat protein because it's probably been about 3 hours since I had my previous protein intake. So, the timing, especially if you're working with somebody who does train hard, who trains multiple times a day, that's another big one. If you're training, 1 or 2 or even 3 times a day with some of our athletes, timing is really critical because you need to get ready for the next session. If you have somebody who trains maybe 4 days a week, it's not exhaustive exercise. Would I say that timing is critical? No. Would I say it doesn't matter? I don't know that I'd go that far. I would just basically say, if you can't eat something right away, don't panic. But there's no point in not doing it if you have the capacity to. So, I just think it's all in how you parse out the message. And I think one of the reasons I like doing the research on the performance side is I like pushing boundaries. I like seeing how much we can do and when to pull back to get the most out of your athletes rather than how little we can do. And look, some people would argue, yeah, but if you can find the lowest effective dose, isn't that more efficient? Maybe, but when you're working with an athlete where hundredths of a second make all the difference, I still kind of want to know what the maximum is I can do too. What can I tolerate and how do I buffer that as much as possible? To me, that's where the research gets interesting. And again, it's just a good example of the difference between the sport and the physique nutrition. It's the message you're relaying and the relative importance you place on any one factor.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's such a great point that you brought up, because nowadays, if you look at the fitness industry, it's like you said, nothing matters anymore. Just do what you want. And the thing is with nutrient timing is that I think it's more about, like you said, priorities. If you have your total protein, that's the next step that you can focus on. But
exactly,
nowadays you see people in the gym, if they see a bro at the gym drinking a protein, it's more like, oh, bro, you're such an idiot for drinking a protein shake. It's not that it's detrimental to your...
No, that's exactly it. Yeah, they make it seem like it's a bad thing now. And I don't blame Brad or Alan or any of those guys that have done that. That's not the message they've sent. They've never said it was bad, but somehow that's what gets lost in translation. Or some people are like, oh, why are you eating right after? You don't have to do that. It's kind of funny. Again, it's the can we, should we, right? It's like, can we wait to eat? Sure. Should we? Why? It's kind of like, it's almost like Jurassic Park. Has nobody ever seen Jurassic Park? Can we make dinosaurs? Yes. Should we? No, they eat the guests. So it's a can we, should we kind of thing, And so I think that we need to wrap our mind around that a little bit and start to figure out what the common sense is that goes with this too, and what message we're going to give. If nothing else, I like the fact that information does help emphasize the importance of total protein intake. That's critical, because here's the other end. If all you're worried about is timing, pre and post, and your protein intake overall is deficient, you're not going to make a difference there either. So you kind of have to have it all put together. And then, hell, we could get into the timing with eating before bed. There's great work being done by Mike Ormsby, Luke Van Loon, where they've shown that protein intake before bed is even more anabolic as well. So here's another timing issue. To me, timing matters all day. One of my colleagues here at Rutgers, Dr. Andy, had made a comment. She said, every meal is an opportunity to hit the leucine threshold. So why not eat when you can keep that overall recovery, repair, and hypertrophy process going? Like I said, I just think it shouldn't be the path of least resistance. I think it should be an ability to push your boundaries, find out what helps you do that to the maximal effectiveness. And, it's even like the high rep training. the 30 reps to failure versus a more traditional 10 RM. Well, okay, great. They both maybe work for hypertrophy. The heavier weight's been found to be better for strength, though. But here's where I get lost in that a little bit is that 30 rep program just took you 3 times the total time. How is that efficient at all? And you're not producing better results. It's one thing if you're working with an athlete where you basically tell them if you put in more time, here's the added benefit you get. When you can't even show me what the added benefit is, only that it's as good, but it takes longer to do, that I don't understand. I think it's great from a scientific standpoint. It brings up some interesting mechanistic questions. From an application standpoint, I find it completely uncompelling, because why am I going to use that? And even then, if I have somebody who can't lift heavy weights, honestly, 14, 15, 16 reps, that's not exactly heavy weight. So even splitting the difference might make more sense. But I get why it's done. It just doesn't present the same story that I think a lot of people believe it does because it's a cost to benefit issue.
Yeah, I totally agree on that, Shawn. So Shawn, this was an amazing talk. It was a real pleasure to have you on and discussing these things. And I wish we had more time to discuss even more of these topics. But we can maybe leave it to another time and do another
Absolutely, be happy
follow-up.
to come back on. I love talking to you. I think what you're doing is fantastic, and props to you for bringing people on that can discuss the science and the application with you. I think what you're doing for your audience is fantastic. They may not like me, but I know you've had other good guests on, so it might be okay.
Thank you so much, Shawn. I really appreciate the kind words. So, where can people find more information about you?
Sure. So you can find me very easily through Rutgers University, through our website. But if they want to follow me on Twitter, it's just at Shawn Arent, ShawnArent. Actually, my Instagram is the same thing. And then on Facebook, we have a page for our center. It's the Rutgers Center for Health and Human Performance. So if they just look up Rutgers Center for Health and Human Performance, they should be able to follow us there as well. Would love for people to check out what we're doing. We try to only post our work, but other relevant things that are going on in the exercise science and sports science community and sport nutrition. And I think, for any of the people that listen to this, any opportunities they have to attend some of these conferences that speak to sport nutrition and training modalities, take advantage of it. We just got back from the International Society of Sport Nutrition International, the main conference in Clearwater, Florida. And man, it was a great program this year. We had some phenomenal speakers, great attendance this year. So between that, National Strength and Conditioning Association, American College of Sports Medicine, the stuff you guys have over in Europe, take advantage of it. I think it's a great educational opportunity, and it helps you work around just the social media crap, and the one thing I will caution people about is just remember, just because somebody has a lot of followers doesn't mean they know what they're doing. Yeah. So don't equate the two. Now, that doesn't mean they have a lot of followers and don't know what they're doing. It's just that don't use that as your barometer for expertise because they don't always go hand in hand.
Yeah, I totally agree. And especially on attending conferences, it's just not that you can learn new stuff and keep yourself updated, but it's a great way to meet new people and connect with them.
Absolutely.
So I totally agree on that. Okay, Shawn, thank you once again so much for doing this podcast. And
thanks for having me on, Jum. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you took the time, and have a nice day.
You too. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.